Sure. I can get into like a lot of the nuts and bolts of what I feel would be a part of adjudicating in that area. And one of those is just, the students show a simple awareness and understanding of things like spacing between each other in the form as the form develops over time, right? Do they show an understanding of how the form should expand and contract and that such those things from set to set? Does a student maintain a consistent step size from the start to the finish of the phrase? And do they understand, what it means to travel in a straight line path or in a curved path, or if it's a follow the leader? It's just a basic understanding of what is the form that I'm in and what is my individual responsibility within that form and throughout a phrase. Things like maintaining upper and lower body control through various tempos, different step sizes, various directions, forward, backwards, slides. So you could go on and on about like the nuts and bolts of how that all affects, their control of form and interval as they move throughout the show.
And I think something that we're seeing a lot more of in the past few years is the layering of choreography on top of all of those elements as well. So it oftentimes is not the first thing that we think about as teachers, like what is their spacing as they're doing a dance phrase moving across. But once we start to get to the area sheet, and then eventually as you get to the stage sheet, what will set you apart is, are you able to do all of those things in your choreographic moments as well as just your straight marching and playing moments? And then on top of that, are you choreographing something while they're playing as well? And those that I think really achieve at a high level are the ones that are able to pay attention to, their body, the form, their interval, their control of the equipment, especially as you're starting to ask them to do more than just straight left, right marching.
Right, that's a great point. And it got me thinking about actually our opening impact in our show from this past year. It was a full ensemble choreographed moment with an opening hit. And so we went through this whole process of teaching them the movement and defining, every count, every shape. And so, you get that and it's great. And then you put them out on their drill set. And if it's a traveling moment of movement, then you have to go back and say, okay, not only on this count does your leg shape need to look like this, or your toe, or the flex or the point, but you've also got to make sure you've traveled an 8 to 5 step on that count, or 2 8 to 5 steps past the dot to get back to it. So, that's a great point of when you're doing something like choreography and body movement, that they do understand how that fits within the confines of drill and spacing and form, and that there's still an understanding of that as they do that choreographed moment for the effects.
Yeah, so I think a great example of the band choreography and maintaining, body control and the control of the equipment and form and interval would be Marcus High School 2017 when they did Prodigy, the last year that they were at Grand Nationals. The first portion of their production, they were on side one in a block, and the full band was there for a pretty good amount of time, and it was crystal clear. And I think because it was crystal clear, it added so much depth and nuance to the program because they considered all of the details of what they were doing while they were doing band choreography, that it started them, I think, at a different level, like having that attention to detail in more than just marching and playing, but making sure they took the band choreography into consideration with that first part of that box, the control of form and interval, control of body, and the control of equipment.
Yeah, and being able to do things like that with your group and teaching them that kind of awareness and that level of detail through simultaneous responsibilities and demands, that's going to be one of the things that sets your group apart, from all of the others, is when you can look at a particular group and see that it's not just, okay, we're marching this set of drill here, but oh my goodness, there's this whole other responsibility that they're having to have while they're doing XYZ to maintain that level of concentration and clarity and form and detail so that it's communicating clearly upstairs.
Which I think as a judge is where we get to the last bullet point of recovery, where that's important. Because you could be looking at two groups and you see, let's take Marcus 2017, they have all of that responsibility of the body and the form, and it's clear. You see a couple students make a mistake, but then you see them recover. That takes training and skill and thought.
Right.
And that to me, when I see that just as an audience member or as a judge or even as another director, I think, wow, that's really impressive. Almost to a certain extent, it means more to me that they were able to recover in such a great way than if they had just done it right the first time.
Right, and that goes with like the level of professionalism that you see on, several parts of the sheet, and the poise, and, how that energy is communicating upstairs through the individual level, and that the fact that a student can recover in a situation like that is a huge testament to the training that they've had, and just the mental space that they're in when they're performing.
And then I think with regard to those last 4 bullet points of the precision and timing, demonstration of individual style, poise, presence, and communication, I think a lot about your production, New York, the last time you guys were at Grand Nationals, the responsibility of the performers to be in character the full time, to demonstrate that individual style, and to demonstrate that, well, not just demonstrate, but communicate that character the entire time. They weren't in just a band uniform, they were in a sailor's uniform, they were in a sailor's outfit, so they had an additional responsibility of having to maintain that character the entire time, on top of maintaining good form and good control and great sounds and great marching. So that adds a whole nother layer of responsibility that I think as a judge has to be taken into consideration. But then also when you look at recovery, like I would imagine you spent some time talking about how to recover in character as well, to make sure that you didn't suddenly get jolted out of the story and the performance.
Right.
So those are important things, I think, to consider when you're judging, especially as you get towards the back half of the season, like being able to see that professionalism from those students and really take that into account of their ability as a performer, and how that should really weigh heavily for you.
Well, and I think one of the major parts of what everybody needs to understand when they're looking at an individual caption on a sheet is students understand it, and judges understand it, directors understand that the individual contribution, the individual awareness, the unified approach from person to person is paramount to what you're going to get upstairs. So both, field and ensemble go hand in hand in that respect, and I think, that gets lost sometimes in translation. So whatever you can get your individuals to understand at that very fine level, and to understand it at the same magnitude from concept to concept, and from portion of show to portion of show, is going to translate in a really effective way upstairs that's going to be engaging, and it's going to communicate just really clearly.
Well, and I do think with the addition of the rarely, sometimes, usually, consistently, and always that's at the top of the sheet, you can look at a production like New York, and let's say you were toward the end of the season and a student made a mistake and they recovered really well. That's not necessarily an indication of them not consistently or always applying what they're being asked. In fact, I would argue that the recovery would make an even stronger point for them to be considered consistently or always there. But in the same token, if you see a program that's, asking their students to portray a specific character like yours were, and you're not seeing that demonstrated across the entire ensemble, that's where you're going to be able to look into the rarely, sometimes, and usually category, no matter what point in the season that you're at.
Yeah, when it comes to that part of the sheet, it's really assessing the frequency at which you're noticing certain things happen, right? What were the big takeaways after you can go back and reflect on the show? Is, do I remember thinking this often? Do I remember thinking, oh, well, that's something that I hadn't noticed before, and they aren't really doing it here? So yeah, it's just that level of frequency that you're seeing it take place throughout the production.
I think as you start to look at the full ensemble, you're looking at, from a professional standpoint for me, we talked about her show New York and about how it required a certain character. So for me, I would look to see if that character is being portrayed throughout the entirety of the performance. Is it happening in transitions? Is it happening when they're moving to and from props? Is it happening with the performers that are moving the props? I think that's something that needs to be considered as well. Just because they're not wearing the band uniform and they're pushing around a prop doesn't mean that we can't see them. They're a part of that production.
Yes, and to that point, there were plenty of times where we had to really zero in on what we were seeing from those individuals, for an example. So, if you're going to use props in your show, and sometimes you have to learn the hard way, if you're going to use props in your show and you've got kids moving props around, they are a part of the performance. And how often you can get them to be in character or to move, appropriately for the moment is going to be a really critical part of what's communicating upstairs, and also, are these students involved in the same way from a performance standpoint as the rest of the ensemble. And that is something that I think a lot of us overlook sometimes. That is a really important factor that shouldn't be forgotten.
And if it's overlooked, I don't feel as a judge I would be able to put that ensemble in the consistently or always level of the sheet if we're not taking care of all aspects of everything that's happening on the field. So it goes further than just the performers transitioning from prop to prop, or the color guard transitioning from onto the field and off to the field and then back on again. Those are things that we see constantly that do need to be attended to if you would like to get that ensemble toward the top half of the sheet, or to get your own ensemble to be able to get to the top half of the sheet, is attending to all those odds and ends. But for sure, the performers that are moving around props, they're just as integral to the entire performance as the musicians on the field.
In 2015, we had, this is, if you're going to go down the big prop route, we had this big sundial type thing that we had to move, and sometimes we had to use our extra marchers to move that. Sometimes we used the color guard, sometimes we used our trumpet section, and depending on the musical moment, depending on whether or not you could hide them or not hide them, really determined how we had to teach those kids to move and be a part of that ensemble moment, right? I remember having to get the color guard, having to push this thing that just weighed 1,000 pounds, and they had to do it with flowy arms, and it was just like, oh my gosh, and to try to keep them in character and make it flow and be musical. That's just, those are parts of a show that again, you don't want to overlook. And then in terms of transitions, pauses in between movements and breaks, whether or not students are maintaining, or if they're staying involved in the performance during those moments. If your color guard is having to have an equipment change and you can't really hide what they're doing with a prop or a flat or whatever, are they moving with a purpose? Are they moving in character? Is there still drill and form control and everything like that as they move into that? Or is it just a function of what's going on? Do they lose you from a performance standpoint or from an ensemble moment standpoint? Likewise, in between movements, how do you captivate your audience and engage your audience and have your students demonstrate that we are still performing for you, even though the show has stopped for a moment, right? Or there's a silence, or there's a dip in the energy, that there's this constant awareness of what the ensemble is supposed to be communicating in those times.
For me, I think this starts with one really simple phrase: if you can hear it, you have to see it. And that is the bottom line of anything that you would want to start with as both a director and as a judge. So if I hear it, I need to see it. And not only that, but where I hear it is where I need to see it.
Yes. When it comes to looking for what you're hearing, if I hear a trumpet feature all of a sudden begin, and I'm looking around like, where are the trumpets? Then obviously there is a disconnect in the staging and where that particular section should be. Or if there's a soloist, I can't tell you how many times I watch a show and you hear a soloist coming through the microphone, and you have no idea where to look, and you're sitting here looking and looking and looking, and where are they? I hear them, but where are they? And in a moment like that, if you can't do something special with the drill, then you get a color guard member. You get one color guard member to go out there and twirl around that soloist so that your attention is where it needs to be. So staging is a huge part of this caption, and determining whether or not the elements are cohesively planned throughout the production.
And I think how it's represented is also worth discussing. More often than not, we will see a really intricate woodwind run maybe being represented by something where the visual choreography, both from the color guard or the band, is really locked into the quarter note and not actually representing what we're hearing. So it's not just enough to make sure that what you hear and what you see are in the right place, but you've got to make sure that the details and the nuance of the musical phrase is also picked up in the writing of the band choreography, in the writing of the color guard choreography, and sometimes that's about making the appropriate choice from a color guard perspective about what equipment is being used there. So if you have a really delicate moment that requires a lot of technical skill from a woodwind ensemble, maybe a big bulky swing flag would not be the best way to pick up that moment. Maybe it could be articulated better with a dance soloist or a saber or a rifle or some sort of prop that fits with the show that can be just as nimble and just as intricate and just as delicate. And I think that that's something that would also, you know, lend an ensemble to be more towards the top side of the sheet of being able to say they consistently reinforce the music visually with what we're hearing. You know, they took into account that that's a really delicate moment. Or on the opposite side, that moment requires a whole lot of power. So maybe a bigger piece of equipment, bigger, bolder movements, something that's a little bit more athletic in nature as opposed to something that looks a little bit more refined or almost ballet-esque.
Right. And when it comes to the part of the sheet that says effective use of all performing elements, one of the things that I would look for is to see if all of the groups in the ensemble are contributing to the whole in a meaningful way. Or are you just leaning on the color guard? Are you leaning on your trumpet section? Are you leaning more on your woodwind section? And so you want to look to see if all of the performers are being asked to perform at the same level, given the same demands, the same expectations, and so that you're showing strengths through the entire group and not just kind of these little subgroups that would maybe unintentionally communicate that, you know, hey, not all of these students out here have been trained at the same level or have been given, you know, the appropriate information to get them all to the same level.
And I do think that you started to key in on something there about talking about what the entire ensemble is doing. Let's say we have a woodwind feature going on down at the front, you know, the front of the field. You do have to take into consideration how everything else impacts that, both as a judge and a designer, you know, and oftentimes you'll get a drill writer where things are just kind of moving, and it's kind of your responsibility. It is your responsibility as a director to figure out how to make sure that you have a multiplicity of events that really brings your eye to what it needs to be because of what you're hearing. You know, so taking into account which way are they facing? You know, what kind of choreography are they doing? Do you take a moment and just kind of pause them and clump them up, and it gives some sort of a textural quality that they can then move out of after that? And I think a really well-balanced program that would be hitting the consistently and always portion of the sheet is someone that's going to take into account how everything is working together based on what you hear, whether it's a big moment or a soft moment or anything, and how you're coordinating those events and the groups that you're going to be able to reward more, or the groups that will think about this are the ones that will be able to be rewarded more. I think about New York. You know, there were multiple moments in New York where you could see little vignettes of things happening on the backside of the field that almost like theater, it just added so much more interest because you're like, wow, they even thought through those performers in the back, the last 5 flags, how they looked and how they contributed to the performance and how that related to the soloist that was down front. You know, and that allows, I would think, for your program, if we were using these new descriptors, to be in the always section of the sheet, because you were always attending to those little details and making sure that those last 5 flag performers were supporting that small ensemble moment or that soloist that was happening up front, as opposed to distracting from.
Absolutely. And I think one way that you, as a director, could do this, and when you're judging, that one way you can assess this is, you know, don't look in the obvious places, right? I mean, it's so easy for some judges and directors to stare at what's right in front of them, or when you're up on your tower, you know, you tend to look what's right in front of you. And if you can force yourself as a judge, as a director, to look in those places, look off on the sides, look out in the edges, in the back corners, way up on the front sideline, on the extremities, to see if the whole picture has been addressed, and if there's anything that's been left behind and kind of just tossed aside, or if the whole package is working together, and that there's an obvious commitment to communicating whatever it is you're trying to get across musically and visually through every single element, every single moment. Is that a challenge? Yes. I mean, that definitely takes time. It takes a lot of eyes and a lot of watch it again and videos and things like that. But as a judge, you have to be able to look all the way across the field and assess whether or not all those things are being addressed. And if you see that, then you're going to have more of that. I'm always seeing this through line. I'm always seeing this commitment to professionalism, to the concept, to the movement, the music, the drill, whatever.
A personal run-in with this. The first year that I got to Coppell, we were really dealing with rebuilding the color guard, and so we relied heavily on using band members to fill the back half of the flag line. And we went to a contest, and the judge, much to my benefit, paid attention to the 10 kids up front that were superb, and they did not pay attention to all of our vulnerabilities that were happening on the back. Now that, to the other programs that were way more coordinated than we were, did not turn out well for them, because we weren't working with a judge that was looking at that holistic package. So I benefited that day from a judge that didn't take all of those things into consideration, but what it, from a very selfish perspective, it actually allowed me time to go, oh man, the discrepancy of the skill level and contribution from the front half of the field is not anywhere near what's going on in the back half, and that's something that I had to put a lot of time into. But I think that if I were looking at this now, and you were judging my program with everything that you had said, there's no way that I could have gotten anywhere above the middle of the usually category, just with how lopsided my attention was to the front of the field to the back. Now at that time, we couldn't really have done any more than we did, but that was definitely a moment where somebody kind of missed that mark that I think as a judge, as you get toward, those last couple of rounds of, state on the 4A sheet, an area, you have to be able to take those things into consideration, because it really will separate the people that have made sure that they are reinforcing the music with what you see versus the people that at that point, that's all I could really pay attention to.
Well, and a side note to this, and I know we're talking about judging all of these elements, and it's very, tick the box in business. But when you make sure that you're putting effort into every single aspect, those kids know that they matter. Those kids know that they're important and that they're valued, and what they're contributing is not something that's been forgotten. And so, I keep going at this from a director standpoint and a judging standpoint. And so if you're doing that as a director, then when it comes time to putting a number down on the sheet, you're more likely to have a judge see that and reward you for it. And then tenfold, every student has buy-in and knows, hey, I'm a meaningful part of this.
And I do think, actually, I'm going to go back to that scenario. The band kids that became a part of that flag line that were really struggling at that particular point of the season with being able to transition from being a musician to a color guard performer, ended up after that contest actually was when we realized, like, hey, the front half of the field, they're okay, we need to really start sinking some time into the training on the back. I ended up getting the best 4 captains out of some of those performers that I ever had, because they ended up understanding how important, like you were saying, how important it was for them to consider what they looked like coming out from the prop in the back, how important it was for that person that was all the way far backside one, that they were just as important as everybody at the front side of the field in regard to their contribution to the music, to the entire ensemble, to the production as a whole. Yeah, so with regard to the bottom half, the bottom points of the third box, continuity and flow, the coordination of staging, I think that there are 2 really important things that need to be considered. The integration of the color guard program throughout the entirety. So we talked a little bit earlier about making sure that what you hear you can see, but also where they are on the field. And I think that should be specifically addressed with regard to color guard, that it's not something where they should just live, like that example, on the front half of the field and the back half of the field. What will really separate a group that can get to consistently and always achieving good continuity and flow is, how do they integrate the color guard? Is it more than just a block on the front and a block on the back, or 2 lines in the front and 2 lines in the back? Are they dispersed within a block? Are they a part of some sort of radial moment where there's musicians, color guard that took time and crafting and a really strong thought process, really good continuity and flow to be able to pull off that movement, and groups that are able to get to consistently and always on the sheet? You're going to see really sophisticated or inventive and creative ways to integrate the color guard into the program. And those that are not able to do that might not be able to hit that end of the sheet if they're returning to the same forms and the same looks over and over again to represent the music. And I do think you have to ask yourself, how many times can you represent the music from the same basic block? How many times can you represent a different phrase of music in the same basic arc? So what are different ways, as a designer, can you integrate your color guard to make sure that what you're seeing and what you're hearing looks different than what you've seen and what you've heard in the previous 5-6 minutes of the production? And then as a judge, are you seeing and hearing the same visual representation over and over and over again? And at what point are you able to use, sometimes, usually, consistently, and always, to be able to separate the programs that really take a chance at trying to be visually artistic with what you're hearing versus those that resort to the same look over and over and over again to try and express the same? Ultimately, they won't express the same.
Yeah, there's a level of risk-taking that drill writers and directors have to be willing to take, because playing loud in a block is safe, right? Or playing loud in a couple of big giant arcs is safe. And it's really easy to default to things like that. And it's okay to have those moments in your show, but you don't want to have that kind of moment every single time you have a park and bark, right? And if for some reason you end up in that scenario and the drill's written and you can't really do anything about it, then you have to figure out ways to make that moment look and feel different than the last moment, whether that's through movement or a different way to interpret what they're doing visually. So, you know, the risk-taking factor is really a big part of exploring all these different ways to create different looks and staging. In terms of continuity and flow, you know, you're looking for the production to, as a whole, to see if it exhibits things like seamless flow between productions, and is that happening through the whole performance? Does the pacing from one effect moment to the next, does it seem engaging, and is it effective? Does it make sense, or does it just kind of come out of nowhere and feel disjunct? Is there a logical progression of ideas that develop in a logical way from the introduction, the inception of that idea or that phrase, and all the way to its resolution? Does it feel natural? Does it take you on a journey, in a sense? Things like, you know, is each group placed appropriately throughout the production in order to maximize that subgroup's contribution to the phrase or to the moment or to the movement of the show? Another thing you can consider when it comes to coordination and staging is it clear what the visual focus is at all times? And like, for example, if there's a trumpet feature, I said this already, is it clear what the visual focus should be at all times? Are you trying to feature the color guard at a certain point? And are they right where you hear that musical moment coming from? Or are you hearing the sounds come from this side of the field and then you're giving your visual focus over here? You want to make sure that those two things are cohesive, and that's really important. So does the production take you on a visual journey, and does it take you there in a seamless way? Does it take you there in a meaningful way, an engaging way that it keeps you engaged in what's going on from production to production, from transition to transition, from moment to moment? Or are you feeling that, you know, okay, well, that piece didn't make sense with this. That production didn't really have anything to do with that. That visual moment really doesn't seem to fit what this music is asking for. So I think this part of the sheet, of course, could be very subjective, but and there's a lot of things that go into it. And I think a lot of people could debate a long time on, you know, what you want to reward and what you don't reward. But at the end of the day, you know, are you seeing what you're hearing? Are you hearing what you're seeing? And does it have a flow to it that takes you on that journey?
For me, it's like a good roller coaster ride. Like I think about high points in performances. You mentioned a park and bark earlier. For me, a park and bark is not effective if the way you get into it and the way you get out of it don't make any sense. Like if it feels visually abrupt, or, you know, jumping onto a different sheet, if it feels musically abrupt, it's lost its effectiveness. So both as a designer and a judge, those are things that I think you have to think about that roller coaster ride. The peak of the roller coaster, that anticipation building up, is all to service the down, you know, and then you get to another and another and another. And I think that keeping in mind, both as a designer, as a teacher, but also as a judge, like, did they go on a good roller coaster ride? Like, did we get to the top and all of a sudden there was no more track and we fell off? You know, like those are things that I think you have to both consider as a designer, but also as a judge. And some of the things that, you know, we've talked about a few things that I think could derail that roller coaster. Bad transitions. If you don't consider, you know, like, we got to this big prop, this prop is the moment. Like, we're all on this. Claudia Taylor Johnson did a performance where they had these really neat stairs that were off on side one, and it had a really cool, like, visual effect to it where it looked like a tessellation. It was almost 3D. How they got in and how they got out of it was very crafted. So those moments that were on that prop was so much more effective because how they got on and how they got off. If they hadn't attended to those details, then what really was the moment in the first place? And I think as a judge, you would be able to look at that and say, wow, they always considered that because they got up there and they got off of there, sometimes without me even seeing. So I was so wrapped up in that moment that I can say that group consistently or that group always did it, versus the group that maybe wouldn't consider, that would have some prop performers that weren't really involved in the entire performance, that push it center stage, and then we turn, we walk, we get set, we play for a park and bark moment. Well, the park and bark doesn't mean anything if the flow in and out doesn't work. For me, one of the productions that I worked on that I think had one of the best kind of end of the roller coaster moment for me, at 2015 Wakeland, we did a show about a George Seurat painting, Sundays in the Park with George. And at the end, we had a silent flag feature, which was I fought for that sucker. Like, it was gonna go in no matter what, because we had a great color guard and I wanted to make sure that they were featured. So as the entire production started winding down, things were kind of moving off to different props, and these color guard members had just kind of spiraled into the middle of the stage, and before you knew it, they were there in a form that had great placement, and, you know, the lines were clear. Where they were on the field was clear. It was in relationship to the soloist that had just ended, and then they had a really great phrase of about 2/16 that you could hear the whooshing of the flags in the Alamo Dome. And it was built in such a way that everything was winding down, and then you were left with this breathless moment. And as they spiraled out, we ended up with the girl in the white dress with her mom at the end, which is where, you know, the ultimate focus needed to go. But we did I think, in my opinion, we did a great job of making sure that that roller coaster wound down to the right moment where getting into it and getting out of it was so seamless that it was so much more impactful than if they had just run in, spun, and run out. So I think as a judge and as a designer, you have to take into account how you're setting up those moments and placing almost more importance on the transitions in and out than maybe just the park and bark itself, because you'll be able to separate groups as you start to line up those ordinals of, wow, they consistently and they always considered that continuity of flow and the pacing, like you were talking about, the pacing in the program, versus the group that didn't and really put their emphasis on the park and bark moments.
What's super cool about the moment that you were just talking about, having your color guard, and that's a strength that you want to lean on, is definitely like, my guard can do this, so let's showcase that. You know, not only are you going to the point of, you know, how you staged them and the moment you're trying to create, but that also goes hand in hand with the professionalism factor and the poise factor. So, you know, there's a lot of crossover with a lot of these that you know, that you can take away from these sheets, which was really great and part of, you know, the progress, I think, of this new judging system.
Yeah, so I mean, some of these things are pretty hard to get freshmen and sophomores, and I mean, sometimes even juniors and seniors to do pretty consistently. You know, like good control of their form and their interval and their body, and, you know, precision and timing. I watched a documentary around Christmas one year that was on PBS about the New York City Ballet, and they have all of these young kids that are performing with these professional, you know, like professional ballet dancers. And she asked, the interviewer asked the director, like, how do you get them to look so confident? And she said, we consistently practice the same way, and we give them a lot of opportunities to perform in front of people to where by the time they get to this point, it is so ingrained in them that they have no nerves. And from that point on, that is something that has kind of stuck in my, I mean, that must have been 10 years ago, that's stuck in my head ever since. A consistent approach to how we practice and giving them as many performance opportunities as possible. One thing that I really like about working at Coppell is we do the competition program at the first football game. And man, it is never good that first time out, but it gets them in front of people that are loud, they care more about their popcorn and when their quarterback's coming back out, and they really have to fight those nerves of having all of these distractions, but be able to key back in on the things that we're consistently approaching in rehearsal. And I think that having that performance opportunity in an environment that is ultimately more chaotic than anything that they're going to experience at the region, the area, or the state level, really, really helps them to work on all of those little details that it takes to pull off a performance, I mean, really of that magnitude. 7 to 8 minutes is a long time to be on, mentally, physically, emotionally. So the more opportunity they have to perform that under the lights, in the sun, like facing the sun, facing away from the sun, as many different variables as I can get, but approaching what's happening within those variables as consistently as possible, I really do think helps prepare our performers for success.
Yeah, and you have to start with really clear and defined fundamental training. And, we try to make sure that not only is it as clear and concise as it can be, but you're providing visual examples along the way for the students to use to learn. There needs to be a logical progression of introducing fundamental movement skills over time. You want to make sure that, as you're training these kids to go out and be assessed, that you're being smart about where you start and who you're starting with. You might have to vary the approach depending on which groups of students you have. For instance, you can't start the same way with your returning 10th, 11th, and 12th graders on posture the same way that you would start on posture with a brand new marcher, or start talking about 8 to 5 or 6 to 5, right? So a lot of it's going to depend on the specific group that you're working with and how you start from the beginning of a certain skill set and which skill you're teaching at that time. So you're going to want to differentiate how you give your instruction to meet the various needs of the group or the individual. And back to your point, once all of that information is solidified and once the students have a clear understanding of what it is that you're asking them to do, repetition, and constant reinforcement is going to not only, again, reinforce what that information is, but it's going to give them confidence. And so when they can go out and know exactly what to expect and give them that high level of performance that you're wanting them to have. So you always start with that clear and defined expectation, make sure they understand it, apply it, and then do it again and again and again and again. And I like to always say to my students that experience is going to build confidence. So that experience doesn't always have to be at a performance, right? That experience, that confidence can be gained just by doing it again and over, so that there's that absolute understanding of, I know how this is going to go, right? I'm not going to be surprised by what happens in a performance because I have done all of these things so many times prior to my performance. I think that's really important.
Which I think we can also segue that back to an ensemble that exhibits really high levels of recovery. That shows that you have approached this, in that manner that you were talking about, that those performers could encounter something like a big gust of wind in the middle of the performance, or maybe it suddenly starts raining in the middle of it, but they are so practiced and they are so prepared that they can encounter those obstacles and be able to recover. I wanted to jump back to what you were talking about with a logical introduction of skills. I mean, I am so impressed with the way that Tarpon Springs Band moves and dances around. I mean, it's fantastic for high school students. And I look at that and I go, wow, I really wish that we could implement that into our program. But what you're looking at there is a logical introduction of those skills over a really long period of time. And I think as an adjudicator, when you start to look at things like band body and, even like posture and how they move, you're going to be able to see, like the programs that are able to hit that consistently and always on the sheet, because they started with, let's do a really clean passe. Let's make sure that everybody knows how to do a tendu. It would be really easy to hire somebody to just come out and throw a bunch of choreography on the band. But what will set your program apart, or what you can use as an as a judge to set programs apart when you're setting out those ordinals at the area contest or at the state contest, is you can tell the difference between a group that logically applied those skills
Right.
and really trained the program from the ground up versus someone that just brought in a choreographer and slapped some stuff on there.
Yeah, that should be evident, throughout the movement program of the group is, oh, okay, we have this big impact here. All right, there's a little bit of band body that's there just for the sake of band body. Or I'm seeing, a real commitment to, what body movement and expression and the training, the poise and the balance and all of that, it should really look like. And, you're going to realize that there's training there and that started at a certain point and it progressed in a way that got the kids to that level. So, yeah, you always have to take into consideration who you're working with, what their prior knowledge already is, if any, what their prior capabilities are, if any. And then if you're starting with something that, already has something going for them, then you can build off that. If you're starting from scratch, then you've got to be even more mindful in how you start that movement program and where you want that to end by the end of the season and how you're going to get there. It has to be really smart and planned out so that your students are going to be set up for success.
And I do think that that'll bleed a little bit into something that we'll talk about in a minute, but I think that also goes to your choice of show and your choice of music and your choice of staging and your choice of design. I wouldn't, in my first year at a program where they've had no training in performance or dance, take on New York like you did. That was the culmination of years of training, and they were able to pull that off, and it felt fun and special because they had the skill set. Versus a program that, like, man, I really like this. I want to do a New York show, but there's no skill set. Like there's no training, there's no build into it. So I think you're also going to be able to, as an adjudicator, be able to tell the people that took time to do that versus those that tried to force something on just for the sake of forcing it on. And that will help you if you're able to recognize that and knowing where to put people in these boxes of usually, consistently, and always. When I sit down, like as a designer and a teacher, I start, it's a very similar process. I call it, what tools do I have in my toolbox? Like what do I have at my disposal from a financial perspective, from a student perspective, from a numbers perspective, community involvement, like all of that has a huge impact on what we're able to accomplish. But the biggest thing that I ask is, can the students do what I want them to do? I could go out there
or are they going to be able to with the right kind of instruction?
Sometimes the best of intentions like fall flat,
right?
Because we think like, oh man, I'm really going to be able to get them to do that.
Yeah, we dream
and then
big.
You realize I've got 8 hours. So I worked at a program in another state years ago where when I walked in, they said, we're going to do a show and we want it to be called The World of Dance. And nothing like the J-Lo show. And I thought, okay, well, tell me about that. And they wanted each of the songs to represent a different form of dance found around the world. And I looked at the color guard and I thought, there's no way. And then I looked at the band and I thought, they've never had a dance class. We cannot do a show called World of Dance. So that was a circumstance where, there was not a lot of thought put into, do we have the skill set? Like, are the kids going to be able to do it? Do the kids even have the personality to pull off something like that? So, and I think that is, for me, the place that I always start is, what is the makeup of the organization? I start with personality, and I kind of work my way back from there. And I do think that from sitting here and speaking with you, like there are obviously like some things that will be added into my thought process with regard to that. But for me, one of the biggest considerations, and especially to do with marching band, is, do we have the time? Because I think if we segue back into the mind of a judge, you're going to be able to get to the end of the season and go, did they have enough time to really like achieve this ambitious idea? And that will be able to give you the opportunity to separate some people. I think I keep coming back to New York because it's one of my favorite shows that I've seen in the last couple of years. You had the time, like you did the right thing with the students that you had and what you were asking them to perform, and by the end of the season, it was spectacular. I'm not entirely sure that, actually I'm entirely sure that if we had tried to do that with Coppell, I don't have the build in my color guard program to be able to achieve what yours did, and we would have seen a completely different level of execution at the end of the season, and I would expect as a judge to be held accountable for that. Whereas you took all of those considerations into play and you were able to pull off something that was very stylistic that not many people could do within the time frame, within the skill set, within the makeup of the community.
Right. Yeah, and with these new sheets and the fact that they are getting a little bit more specific with different elements of the show. You know, I would imagine as directors who haven't dove into, you know, some of these aspects of design and you know, maybe body movement and things like that, that they're going to want to put as much out there as they can to try to get the credit. But, you know, there is an element of realism that everyone needs to have, and it does have a lot to do with how much your program has already performed some of these elements and had training in these certain areas. So if you're a director who, you know, is sort of just now wanting to get into adding these different nuances to your show and making it more developed and have more layers, that yes, you do want to take risks, and there's risks in that, but you also have to be realistic and know that it's a process and that it does take time to develop over several years to get to a certain point that you see from a lot of the most successful groups, that it's not something you can just, you know, plop it in and it's going to happen. It's definitely something that you have to develop over time.
And I think that even kind of harkens back to something that you said before about making sure that there's a very deliberate and systematic way that you're building in those skills. That doesn't just pertain to teaching the students. That pertains to, can the parents move props on and off the field? Can the parents actually construct what you want them to construct? Can the kids even move what you're at? I mean, there's a whole lot to consider there that can all come from that very basic approach that she talked about earlier. You know, and I think sometimes it's worth, you know, mentioning that more stuff is not always the best stuff.
Correct.
If you're not going to utilize it the right way. You can't put things out there and then not reference them. It's kind of the same thing as you can't just ignore a kid standing next to a prop and pretend like we can't see them because they're dressed all in black. If they're there, we can see them. If the prop is out there, how does that fit, you know, with everything there? And as we start to add these latter bullet points in here where these things are starting to be considered at the area and at the state level, that's worth mentioning. You know, what does everything have to do with everything on the field, musically, visually, intellectually even.
And are you doing it in a smart way, and maybe not at the highest level of what you would hope to do that very first year, putting all this stuff out there, but is it something that your group can manage, and is it something that's going to set you up for the next year and the year after that and the year after that, and just having a really clear understanding that it's not something that can just happen overnight. You have to be smart about it. You have to be methodical about it, be specific about it with the specific group that you have, the staff that you have, the designers that you have. And if you have a vision, then plan it out over 3 to 5 years and say, this is what we can do right now. And this is getting some of these new things onto the field and into our production that these judges are going to start to look for. And that way, you know that you're at least, you know, getting all of that going in your program, and that will have benefits that year and in years beyond.
Yeah, and that's something that I think is really important to note. You've touched on this a couple of times, and I think it bears repeating as many times as possible, that for programs that are able to achieve at the level that yours has achieved, there was a very systematic approach to planning on how they got to that point. And I would be willing to bet, like you were talking earlier, how do you utilize the skills of New York to bring what you brought through the COVID year, you know, that it's a constant state of planning. I know for me personally, when I think about my Winter Guard productions, I think about what will this year lead to next year, and how do I make sure that those also impact excellence and execution on the marching band field as well. So it is a constant juggle of making sure that everything is progressing with what you have, you know, at the moment. And sometimes that changes really quick, but you do have to take, you know, those quick quick changes into consideration. Say your school district is rezoned and you lose 100 kids. You may need to reassess what you're doing from a thematic standpoint now that you've lost 100 kids in your program that you were planning on having at that point. But I think if I could succinctly put it, the more planned and the more systematic you are about that plan, the better off you're going to be.
And that's going to come across when it comes judge time. Judges are going to see that. So it all comes together in the end.
Yeah.
One of the big things you have to really pay attention to is you have to look at the group that's leaving and what's leaving with that group. You have to look at the group that's coming in and what's coming in with that group, and really be realistic with what the strengths and the weaknesses are, and the areas that you're going to have to really dig back into or not, depending on that new group, because every year is a new group of students, and sometimes you get a really strong freshman class or one that's maybe not so strong, or you lose this incredibly strong senior class, and that kind of leaves a deficit. So you really have to be sure that you're smart about looking at what you have now, not what you did have, what you hope to have. And then kind of on the flip side of that, you do try as best you can to build off of the previous year and what that group was able to learn and what they were able to achieve. Like this past year, even though we had COVID, we knew we couldn't do the show and the production that we had originally planned. But when we went back to the drawing table to see what we could do, West Side Story was not our original show plan, but we had just done the New York show, and we had just gotten the kids to really kind of buy into this more theatrical type production and the character and whatnot. And so we thought, well, let's try and build off that as best as we can and kind of take some of that same idea, even though it was in a much more simplified form due to restrictions and COVID and all that. But next year, as we hope to kind of get back into the swing of things, as everybody hopes to, one of our main goals is to build off of those new skill sets that the kids learned over these past 2 years, and what having the same choreographer for the past 4 years has done to build that vocabulary. And now, instead of teaching 4 grade levels how to do a certain skill and master a certain skill, you're only teaching 1 grade level, right? So you have to think about that kind of thing when you're thinking about the content box as a director and as a designer. You also want to think about the numbers of new students you have entering the program versus returning. That's going to obviously affect the kind of material and the demand that you put on the students. This past year, I think, is going to have a huge effect depending on the circumstances of each school, on how the demands that they put on their students this coming fall. If you were a program who was fortunate enough to do marching band this past fall, then you're going to be starting from a different place in terms of content and what you can ask your students to do versus a program that didn't get to do anything last year. So there's a lot to be said for where you're coming from versus where you want to go, and how you manage your expectations, being realistic with what you expect, but also looking for ways of how to challenge your students so that they rise and they do continue to develop. And it's all just going to depend on the circumstance of that particular freshman class, that senior class, COVID marching band, no COVID marching band, things of that nature as you plan and develop. So, we've spent a lot of time in this discussion talking about things like concept and through line and flow and continuity and all that. And, those are areas of the sheet that are starting to get a bit more credit. But I think it's important to emphasize that at the end of the day, we're always wanting to achieve excellence through the performance, no matter what it is you have out there on the field. You can have a successful show without props, right? You can have a successful group without 300 members on the field. And no matter who's out there and what you're dealing with, you're going to want to be able to see that your students are maintaining a level of excellence musically, visually, and all the details that it takes to pull off a high excellence performance. So, you may not be in a situation where you can have props, or where you've got a 70-member color guard, or you may not be in a situation where you're going to have a choreographer, or that your vocabulary that your students know is very limited. When you get out there, what matters is that they know how to handle themselves, that they know how to perform with their equipment, that the instruments are going where they're supposed to go, that the sounds that they're making are what they're supposed to be, that their bodies are in control, that their drill is cleared, that their form is clear, that they have an understanding of what it is that they're being asked to do out there. And so at the end of the day, that is paramount, and you never want to to tell yourself that those other things matter more. Excellence is the driving force.
A little bit like what we touched on earlier, sometimes more stuff doesn't mean good stuff. You know, so at the end of the day, I oftentimes find myself impressed by groups that have smaller quantities of performers that are able to execute at really high
Oh my
levels
gosh.
because the pressure is so
Highland
much higher.
Park.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and you look at that and you can say like, well, that's just as effective to me as an adjudicator because I'm
Right.
looking at 4 color guard members that are really like carrying these moments and with a lot of high pressure in a smaller performance ensemble, and it is still excellent because at the end of the day, excellence is excellence is excellence. So you don't need all of that stuff, but I do think like what we've been talking about, if that stuff is there, you have to consider the how and the what, but it's not
Absolutely.
necessary to be a successful ensemble.
At the end of the day, we are rating achievement and what is it that we are achieving? What is it the students are achieving? Whether that is concept or that's movement or playing, right? It's whatever's out there, you know, are they doing at the highest level possible? And that will be evident if the training is there, period.
Excellence as an effect. You know, you are excellence as an effect. Pretty much
Absolutely.
says it all.